also okay.
If anybody has any questions, any thoughts, we would request them to put it in the chat. And to kick off the event, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And thank you so much for joining us today to the Jain Philosophy and Professional Ethics session, a virtual roundtable discussion hosted by Young Jain Professionals in collaboration with Arihanta Institute. Before we begin, a quick note. It's going to be a panel session. It is going to be a presentation followed by a panel. If you have any questions, any thoughts, please put it in the chat. We will be monitoring them, and we will try our best to address and make this session more informative for everybody. Quickly to begin with, something a little bit about both the organizations. Young Jain Professionals is a nonprofit organization and a subsidiary of JAINA dedicated to connecting and empowering Jain professionals across North America. Our mission is to increase awareness of Jain principles and heritage while fostering a strong professional and a personal network. Um, through regional dinners, retreats, seminars, community service, learning focused events like this one, and encouraging Swadhyay, the self study of Jain philosophy in a modern practical context. Simply put, YJP exists to help Jain professionals grow both spiritually and professionally while staying rooted in our values. And we are honored to be collaborating with Arihanta Institute, a nonprofit founded in 2022, dedicated to sharing the timeless wisdom of Jain philosophy, history, and culture through world class online education, guided by the principles of ahimsa and karuna. Arihanta Institute focuses on helping individuals apply these values to today's personal, professional, and societal challenges. Today, we are privileged to have three incredible scholars with us, helping and driving this panel and this discussion. Dr. Christopher Jain Miller, co-founder and VP of Academic Affairs at Arihanta Institute, professor of Jain and Yoga Studies, visiting researcher at the University of Zurich, and adjunct professor at Claremont School of Theology. He also serves as the co-chair of American Academy of Religion. Dr. Kogan Bohanek, assistant professor of Sanskrit and Jain studies, who specializes in Jain and Hindu traditions, comparative dharma, and theoethics, and has taught extensively at Claremont School of Theology and Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And lastly, Dr. Jonathan Dickstein, the Tirthankara Shreyansathan Endowed Assistant Professor, whose work focuses on Jainism, religion, ecology, and animal studies, with a PhD from UC Santa Barbara and a research spanning critical and animal food studies. We are really excited to explore Jain philosophy intersects with professional ethics and today's world and what it means for how we work, lead, and make decisions. And with that, I will hand over to Letty, who's going to be helping us driving this discussion and the panel. And let's begin our conversation. Over to you, Letty.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. My name is Letty. I'm with Arihanta Institute, and we're very happy to be partnering with YJP for this educational series. We wanted to start today's event with a presentation from Professor Christopher Miller, and if you have any questions that you would like to submit for the Q&A near the end of the event, please just put them in the chat and we'll include those in our faculty-led discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Jai Janendra, welcome everyone. Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you to YJP, and thank you to Letty as well for putting this event together and the series together. We've always enjoyed having the opportunity to collaborate with YJP. We've done so in live and in online sessions, and we'll continue to do so. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all and to share a little bit with you about engaged Jain professional ethics. I will just give a brief little lecture, if you want to call it that, maybe around 15 minutes here to get us warmed up, and really then to give you and invite you to ask questions to us. So you can think of anything, type it in the chat, and we'll be happy to engage with you about Jain professional ethics, which I'm sure is a topic that is close to all of your hearts, being young Jain professionals and holding that banner, which I included here on the slide as well. Just a little bit about myself, so you know, I've also worked in many professional environments. I continue to work in a professional environment at Arihanta Institute, but before I was an educator, I studied accounting and public accounting. I was a CPA. I worked at KPMG. I've been in your shoes, is what I want to say. So I know where you're coming from. I know the struggles that you go through. I share those with you, and I bring that life experience to this as well, but I also want to hear about yours. So while I was studying accounting, I always had this urge and calling to study first yoga, and then through yoga, I was introduced to the Jain tradition. So here I am many years ago, being blessed by a Digambar monk in India. Here I am being interviewed with the Jain community when we were at Mataji's place in Hastinapur. You see that in the background there. And this was my first trip to India, and I was profoundly influenced by Jain philosophy in my own life. It made me want to do something different with my own life, as a matter of fact. And eventually I ended up getting a PhD in South Asian religions, focusing on yoga and focusing on the Jain tradition. And here we are at Arihanta Institute now talking about engaged Jain professional ethics. Now, what I'm going to briefly do here, just to get us thinking, is I'm going to talk about the Bhoga Upabhoga Vrata, the vows to do basically acceptable work that were a product of the medieval period in the Jain tradition. I'm going to go through some of the trades that were prohibited because I want to show you, because I still think that these have a lot of relevance for today. And I also think they help us think about what the motivations and the intentions behind Jain professional ethics, as I will broadly call it, were, which of course were connected to compassion, nonviolence, not wanting to harm others, to karma theory as well. And I'm going to go through some of those here with you, what those prohibited trades were and how they're still relevant and how they might get you to think about the work that you do and why you do the work you do, and whether or not the work that you currently do is something you still want to be doing or change in some way, shape, or form from within. Okay, so there are a couple of different sources that I'm going to be drawing from, both Shvetambra and Digambra, as you see here. And I want to flag that because I want to say that this is a shared ethic or shared set of ethics across these traditions. And even though they're not exactly the same all the time, many of these things and the prohibited trades that I'm going to show you right now, these key prohibitions on things one should not do in one's work, are definitely shared across traditions. So no matter where you're coming from, I just want you to feel welcome here. All right, so let me go through some of these and let's look at the intentions behind them. One of the things that you're not supposed to do in Jain professions is use charcoal, anything that uses charcoal. And a lot of us have probably seen this before, right? Haribhadra Suri says that making, buying, selling, or burning charcoal is something you should not do. Why? Because it's environmentally destructive, it kills jivas, and it does a lot of things that are harmful to the environment, okay? And if you think about that today, just to get us kicked off here, coal accounted for, here's a statistic from 2021, 40% of the overall growth in global CO2 emissions in 2021. We know that coal is an extremely harmful substance. We know how bad it is for climate change. And we know that there are some governments that are pushing for it hard, and there are others that are going away from it as much as they can, which is what we need to do to avoid climate collapse, right? This is all the way back. These are in medieval Jain texts, this notion of not working with coal. So is your work connected in some way, invested in fossil fuels and coal, things that harm the climate? Something to think about. Excavation was another thing that was also prohibited for Jains by Jain ascetics who were giving these teachings. Okay, so Haribhadra Suri said, cultivating soil with a plow or digging stick, which would have been the way they would have done it in medieval India. And Hemachandra adds, who wrote the Yoga Shastra, excavating pools, tanks, wells, plowing fields, quarrying rock, shaping of stone. We know today that this kind of coring is highly destructive to the environment. If you look, there are peer-reviewed scientific articles that show that it is not good for the climate, obviously not good for the environment either. And so these destructive tendencies continue to be things we should think about in the work that we do. Do the companies we work for do these kinds of things? Do we want to be involved in them? Animal byproduct trade is also something that is prohibited within the tradition. Why? On the one hand, it's mercenarial. It opens up secondary markets. For example, Haribhadra Suri, drawing from his own time, noted that when you're trading with jungle tribes of his time, you were basically taking ivory to sell on the secondary market. But that, of course, is connected to the killing and poaching of elephants, extreme violence. Even though you're not the one doing it, you are making it possible because you're contributing to that. Fishermen used to sell conch shells. That was another thing. So that was a trade that Jains could have been involved in, but were told to avoid. And Hemachandra said that this really applies to any animal byproduct because any animal byproduct causes harm. We know that eggs, the egg industry, half of the chicks are killed. They're thrown in bags, suffocated, ground up immediately because people want to eat eggs. Even if they're vegetarian, they're eating eggs. That has to happen in order for the eggs to be produced, in addition to all the violence, of course, against the mothers who are producing the eggs. Same with the dairy industry. Cows, 99% or more factory farmed, including in the dairy industry. When we consume dairy, we're contributing to that, right? Or if we work for a dairy, or we work for a dairy company, we're contributing to those kinds of things. Human and animal trade. This is an extremely relevant one. The word that was used here in Sanskrit was kesha. Any creature with hair would be bound up to suffer when tied up, beaten, and hungry and thirsty in certain industries, right? This still happens all the way into the present. So don't work in human and animal trade. And Haribhadra Suri said this would involve trade in slaves as well. So when we think about labor practices, are labor practices fair, unfair? Hemachandra said this refers to living human and non-human animals, right? We're seeing the Epstein files come out right now. Shocking, right? Terrible things with human trafficking. These were things that Jains were to avoid. Mutilation, which also happens with, for example, castrating animals, according to Haribhadra Suri, branding, docking, nose piercing, and cutting ears in doula, doing these harmful things to animals in an industry, or if you're connected to an industry that works and does things with animals, these kinds of mutilation, you were to avoid them. Here's an interesting one we probably all know: alcohol and forbidden food trade. This originally referred to the manufacture of alcohol, the sale of alcohol, the consuming of alcohol that causes, according to Jain texts, infighting and murder among people. Hemachandra said fat from meat, butter, honey, and liquor should also not be something that Jains are involved in. And Devendra, another author, said that no meat, milk, curds, or ghee should be things that Jains are trading in whatsoever. Now, I'm going to continue to go through a couple more things here, but what I want to really note is that when we go through these things, it's one thing to be directly involved in something in the work that we do that would cause these things, and I doubt many people are here, although it's something to think about and reflect upon, that the companies we work for, if they do these things, or if they are invested in these things, so where does our capital go, also counts, right? So I want us to just be thinking about about the kind of work that we do. Do our companies do this? Do we do this? And B, are we connected to it in some way through investment, through capital, and the type of work that we do? Because oftentimes animal agriculture, dairy, meat, all these things are buried somewhere within companies' portfolios, and it's kind of scary to think about, right? Also the production of weapons, which are things that Jains would also not do. The military, these are things that people would avoid historically in the Jain tradition in terms of professions. Breeding and rearing of animals goes along with animal agriculture and the animal agriculture industry. And Hemachandra said that breeding and keeping of destructive animals like parrots, cats and dogs, and monkeys were something that one should avoid. And this is really interesting because in The Guardian, recently an article came out in the last couple of years that showed that the number of dogs in the world, if they were to go vegan, it would save more emissions than what the UK produces, right? And so many people have pets and feed them things that come from animals, right? Industries that produce things for animals, food for animals. And one thing you can do is get away from that, right? And there are Jains who are working towards creating a more vegan world, both for humans and non-humans. And we know that this is one way to do it because it's a significant amount of work that goes into producing these things, these vegan things that are not subsidized like the animal agriculture industry, but it's a huge opportunity for Jains with capital to be able to produce the healthier plant-based foods for the animals, for example, so that the slaughter doesn't have to happen. The house pets are healthier, and the contribution, of course, to the climate is significantly less. Another thing that Jains avoided, and many of us probably know this, is working with fire historically. Why? Haribhadra Suri said, of course, setting fire to meadows so that grass grows more lushly after the rains is extremely harmful. It kills animals, it kills plants, and of course, we know it pollutes the environment. And Hemachandra added and agrees with Haribhadra Suri and says, we shouldn't start fires out of habit. Now, I find this very interesting because one of the things that's happening that's destroying the planet right now in terms of capitalism is the burning of fire to clear forest, to grow beef, and for dairy herd as well. So it's for both, and dairy herd becomes beef at the end of their life anyways. 70% of that, the forest fires that are occurring that NASA has looked at, were in the estimated buying zones of beef companies, right? So again, I don't think people here are working for beef companies, but I'm also thinking about investing and looking carefully at what it is that we invest in and the structures that we support politically that allow these things to continue to happen, okay? So again, creating a plant-based world is one fast way to transition away from this kind of destructive and unnecessary career that many people end up taking up. And along with that, plant destroying, of course, was prohibited. Haribhadra Suri said that purchasing forests and cutting and selling timber were not okay. Hemachandra adds that you shouldn't sell timber and the parts of fruits and plants. Why? Because they're concerned about the life of the plants, as well as their place within the ecological system. Because when you destroy them, you're destroying other forms of life as well. And today we know that global deforestation is a result of so many things that people are doing. How can we as professionals, as people with capital, as people who are concerned about these things, connect those values to forms of professions and work that we do to avoid that 41% of deforestation that's coming from beef alone, including dairy herds, from feeding animals soy and growing palm oil, 18%. 60%, as you can see, or almost 60% of global deforestation is due to animal agriculture. That's an incredible amount, right? Probably more when you count the other animals in addition to cows that are being killed. And then paper and wood, you see it's important, it's 13%, but the mass contribution is coming from beef, palm, and then soy that's fed to animals. And finally, water draining. This one is extremely relevant today, and I wanted to sort of end towards this one because this one is scary, all right? So Hemachandra says we shouldn't drain any water bodies, right? When we see that happening, he says that it kills aquatic life just so they dry up and can be used to grow crops, right? So, and this was most often for animals when this was happening. Now, I don't think there are Jains here who are involved in doing this directly, draining water bodies. But here's something to think about. What we eat, including dairy, including anything that comes from animals, creates a significant amount more of water loss than any kind of plant-based food that we could eat, right? And I learned that from the Jains. I've learned that from the Jains, and myself and my colleagues are vegan, and we feel very strongly about this, not only for the animals, of course, but also for the environment. But even more so, one thing that I really think about when I think about water bodies today is the use and proliferation of artificial intelligence, which has sped up and improved our lives in so many ways, but also requires such a significant amount of natural resources, including water and land and energy, in order to operate. So how do we as professionals think about, in all the work that we do, how we're using artificial intelligence and what it could be doing potentially to the environment and even to people, indigenous people? There's so many issues tied up with the land and water use that are really scary and striking, right? So what can we do in our professional lives to not contribute to that individually, and then also structurally? What could we do? What could we do with our capital to create positive change in the world so that artificial intelligence doesn't suck us dry, basically, right? I think Hemachandra would have a lot to say about that today if he were here with us. Now, everything I just shared with you, I'm going to end here and then we're going to open up for discussion in a moment, right? Everything that I just shared here with you, you can find in this book, Jaina Yoga, for example. Fantastic book for those who haven't read it. It was published in the 60s. But what I love about this book is it lays out not only Jain professional ethics, but all of the various things that Jain ascetics monks were teaching Jains to do as householders specifically. The things they should do and the things they shouldn't do, including the professions. You can get a deep inspiration of the intention, as I've been saying, behind all of this, which is based in compassion for all forms of life, based in nonviolence and not wanting to harm other living beings and the environment around us, including humans, including plants, including animals. It's all in there. And I find it, if I highly recommend this book to anyone who's wanting to dive in deeper into this subject and topic. The other thing I want to acknowledge here is that we're all human, right? And as you see down here in this last bullet point, Jain moral worlds are being constantly negotiated within specific socio-political pressures. And what I mean is that we're all pulled and tugged in different directions. We want to use AI. We see that it's going to make our life easier. We see that it's going to improve things we do. And then we also know what it does to the environment. We also know what it does to people. We're all in this struggle, right? And so it's something to think, I'm not going to tell us what to do right here, but I want to hear from you as well. And I also want to recommend this book. I just ordered this book because I watched a talk about it called Bankrolling Empire. And if you haven't read this book or heard of this book by Sudev Shet, it's a wonderful book about the history of Jains navigating these political pressures that are taking place in very real time in medieval all the way up into early modern India, as they are, on the one hand, bankrolling empire, the Mughals, the British, holding their money for them and being sort of apolitical about it. And on the other hand, feeling, compelled and pressured to be engaged with society in particular ways, with their capital and with their money. So it's a way to think about the struggles that Jains have gone through historically and where you're at today and what it is you could do in your career, in your profession, to do the kind of work that will avoid and help change and transform the dangers and the violence and the harms that we just saw in the slides that I just showed to you. So I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to turn it over because I want to hear from you all. And my colleagues, Professor Jonathan Dickstein and Koja Bohanek, are also here to answer your questions. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. That was very enlightening, at least for me. So I appreciate you sharing this presentation with all of us and giving us additional resources to look into. Um, and with that, I'll go ahead and start going through a few of the questions that were submitted with the registration form. So my first question, to pull in Dr. Bohanek, um, how would you approach balancing ambition and competition at work, while keeping Jain values in mind?
I'm not sure if it applies for my job. I don't really compete in my job. I kind of operate on, I deeply believe in karma is really it's a real essential core value to me. A lot of my work is demonstrating that ethical statements are factual statements, right? To say something is right or wrong is not just a matter of opinion, but it's actually a fact. And I think that's what a deep belief in karma theory demonstrates. And when you have that sort of as a base sort of belief and orientation to life, and things like competition just, at least for me, it just doesn't make any sense because, everybody's going to get ultimately what they work for, what they do is going to come back. And so I wouldn't think about competition, especially since I have such lovely colleagues too. But I think in terms of, there's a couple issues though, in terms of ethics in my profession. Chris mentioned AI use is very significant. It's been really hard. Increasingly, this is a tool that can be employed with great efficacy for academics. But at the same time, I've spent a whole life reducing my consumption and being vegan and purchasing only secondhand clothing and, really trying to lighten my impact on the earth. And I feel like using AI can be really you can undo some of the progress that I made, karmically speaking, in this life. So I think that's one struggle that I have personally. Also, just technology in general, phones, computers, all of that creates a lot of waste, and it's very hard to obtain those things in an ethical way or a secondhand way. I think that personally, I don't believe in justification for actions. I think that sort of the root of all rationalization for bad behavior starts with justification when we believe that an action is justified. So I just in my personal life and my professional life, I really try to resist any sort of attempt to justify anything and to really look squarely in the face at whatever negative actions I'm committing in terms of my consumption and accepting that they're wrong and that there will be consequences that I will suffer for personally without any sort of idea that it's going to be excused, forgiven, justifiable, nothing like that. And I think with that orientation, it makes one feel more hesitation in one's consumptive patterns and one's behaviors. Like if we really deeply believe in karma, I think that we would really hesitate before we engage in various different acts of consumption, whether that be resources, energy, power, technology, whatever else, clothing, food. And so I just try to keep myself in a state of being somewhat vexed by whatever negative effects that I have on the world and to feel that pain and to feel that pain because I know that it is causing pain and I will myself. So I think that that's a general orientation of Jain ethics that is very helpful in the modern world, in the workplace, and in the professional world, is to really take the karma theory seriously and not just think of it as like a social construct that kind of helps us think about ethics or something, but it's quite literally, something that we will feel at a visceral level. That's a one way to answer that question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I definitely think that karma is going to be integrally tied to ambition and competition in the workplace, and how our actions affect other people. Uh, Dr. Miller or Dr. Dickstein, do you have anything else that you would like to add for that question?
I will just add briefly that when I have worked in very corporate environments, I remember working in public accounting, that of course you feel competition with others for promotion. You feel competition with other companies that are bidding for your same clients. And my attitude always was as a practical, and my first supervisor, by the way, at KPMG was a Jain, very influential in my life. Mira Shah, she's probably not here, but she was wonderful. We always just did our best, and I followed her lead. We did our best to be our best self, the best version of ourself, and to try not to get caught up in the drama. I mean, there's always drama and there's always competition, but what always proved best with clients, and this was following a Jane, right, a real living person who was my supervisor, was that you show up and you are who you are, the best version of yourself. And being grounded in Jane teachings is not a bad way to show up today, and it wasn't historically ever. And Paul Dundas wrote about this in his book, The Jains, that one of the reasons that people trusted the Jains professionally was precisely because they were a trustworthy community in terms of business ethics and professional ethics. And that's precisely why books like Bankrolling Empire have been written, because people trusted them with their money, right? And so I guess this is all just to say that competition will always be there, and all you can do is be the best version of yourself and be the most ethical version of yourself. And I know it's not always perfect, and it never is because it's the business world. But that was the kind of mode that we always were told to follow.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Um, my next question is for Professor Dickstein. Um, how should Jain professionals handle entertaining clients or dining in settings where meat and alcohol are present? And then there's a second question that is related of can eating Jain food in a meat serving restaurant ever be fully aligned with Jain ethics?
Thank you for asking me these very tough questions. And I'm not really I can't really say I can speak to what someone else actually views as what aligns with, say, their personal interpretation of values. What it does remind me of is in the animal rights kind of spaces or animal movement years ago, there was this drive to not sit at tables where other people were consuming like meat and animal products. And it was really strong kind of like movement because there was this notion that there's some way in which you're like in the kind of like anumodana framing of violence in the Jain tradition, that you're somehow consenting, you're somehow approving by being present and not kind of doing anything about it. And while there might be some truth to that, that's largely been abandoned, I think, by people in the movement. They've realized like, well, if you're not at the table, then no one is, right? So if you're actually involved in an educating role or trying to set an example, then you have to be present. And I always used to kind of joke that it's funny if you put one vegetarian or something at a table, people will make jokes, kind of maybe a little bit, but have two or have three or have four, and all of a sudden there's no more jokes happening. So you just have to have that kind of presence. And I think that I'm not really one who's big on micromanaging tiny little things. Like if I sit here or I do this one thing, I'm more of a long kind of range planner. So what's our horizon point? What are we working towards? Are we actually trying to call people in and make changes happen? Have meaningful conversations? Can we respect other people where they are? Not everyone's Jain. Not everyone has been exposed to certain things. I say this all the time. There's many animal advocates who are completely, I don't want to say juvenile, but kind of ignorant when it comes to other issues. But they seem very sophisticated on animal issues. And I want to respect that they haven't had that background either. So this is kind of just a general picture to say that I can't say whether or not you should what food we should have at certain events, and this will be involved with, say, who's funding it and who's organizing it and so on. I really don't take that to be the most important approach. It's kind of like this long vision. You know, what are we trying to engender in culture and teach? And for that reason, I think while I did at some point in my life be a little bit more into that kind of minutia of certain events, later on, I've kind of slackened. Now, does that mean I think like a Jain event should pay for kind of like meat or animal products? No, I don't. I don't think that actually aligns at all. But I think there are other times where it's really hard for us to control, and we have uh, bigger vegan fish to fry, as it were.
Thank you for
May I
that.
add to that?
Yes,
May I add
please.
to that, Letty?
Yes, of course.
Because I think what Professor Dickstein said resonates very much with my experience as well, which is that imagine me, I grew up eating everything, meat-eating American, right? Everything you can imagine I ate, McDonald's, Burger King, whatever, steaks. And then I have my first supervisor in public accounting who's in your position, who's vegetarian, and has me going to lunch with her, right? Well, let me tell you what that did to me sitting with her. It made me think about what I was eating just by her being there. She didn't push it on me. It made me ask her questions. She started to show me what was vegetarian and what wasn't, right? And just her presence alone there was so influential. And this happens all the time in the business world. I know I've heard so many stories from Jains about this. And let me just tell you one more kind of anecdotal story from my own life from recently. Suddenly I was the person in that position, right? Just like you. I was at a conference, at an environmental conference. Can you believe this? And everyone was eating meat, right? Which we know doesn't make sense from everything I just showed you. And you all probably already know that anyways. And I was the only vegan at the table in a group of probably 20 people or so. I don't remember how many it was. It was uncomfortable for me. It always is, as it is for you. And when they asked who's eating vegan, I raised my hand at the table. Nobody else raised their hand. It was extremely uncomfortable, socially uncomfortable. And this is something that Vasile Stanescu points out. Jonathan Dickstein has brought Vasile to Arihanta Institute to teach a course, and we'll be giving a talk later this year in our Vegan Studies Initiative, for example. And he points out that a lot of people go back to eating meat and not being vegan precisely because of the social pressure that it entails. But every day I showed up at the conference, and every day they asked who wants a vegan meal. And guess what? Day two, the next meal, another couple hands go up. By the end of the conference, we went from just me raising my hand for a vegan meal to about half of the people in the room. So your presence alone, I think riffing off of what Professor Dickstein said, your presence alone is uncomfortable for you, but trust me that it is having an influence on those around you.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. One of the things that I'm like picking up on is as a common thread through all of your answers is there seems to be something about having an ethical basis and uh, standing someone standing within their ethics as creating a respectable position socially, and that gives a certain kind of influence on the people around them. And that seems to be a positive way to influence change in one's work environment. So, uh, a lot of the questions that were submitted with registration had to do with dairy and environmental destruction. And I put this as a question for Chris, but of course, anyone, please feel free to contribute. But how can Jain professionals engage with large-scale ecological and ethical crises like factory farming and environmental change?
Great question. I don't have all the answers, but I have some ideas because of the work that I've done in this area, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well. You can think about it on several different levels. You can think about it on the individual level, which you're all used to doing already, of saying, I don't eat meat. And for some of you, I don't eat meat or any animal products, right? I only eat plants, basically. Individually, when it comes together across many, many people, it makes a difference. And you also make a difference just by showing up, being that way, who you are, right? That counts. And it also counts how much we support the structures in society that create it and make it possible for these harms to exist, particularly dairy and animal agriculture, just broadly speaking. And so our vote counts. Some people support animal agriculture, some people don't. We've seen politicians coming out recently who have said that they don't, right? We also see really good politicians who are very socially progressive who are not vegan or vegetarian, right? It's a very difficult, tricky thing to do, to think about. But the important thing to focus on is that the reason that the world is the way it is not only because of how individuals are, but also because of how society is socially and politically. And so as Jains, who control and command a significant amount of capital and are committed to nonviolence and compassion, I think that capital, which includes money, but also social capital, political capital, can be used to influence and influence for compassion specifically, and specifically with regard to the structures that allow subsidies for industries like the dairy industry and other things to be voted out so those subsidies can go elsewhere to create a more healthy world. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Jonathan Dickstein, who's an expert in vegan studies and critical animal studies, because I'm sure he has something good to say about this, if that's okay, Letty.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I think the reason I kind of wanted to chime in here is because when we get a lot of questions, I see some in the chat. A lot of the time when it comes to consumption and harm, we're really talking about like little things, like what if this or what if that, or isn't this also really bad? And it's a lot of micromanaging of small things. You know, what if the dairy wasn't like this? Um, don't you know that the production of this also causes harm? And I was at a Jain philosophy conference in Florida and having a conversation with an Indian philosopher of Jainism, and was telling me about kind of the cows that his family kept at home and the kind of conditions, and kind of asked a similar question, like, isn't this pretty good or less bad? And I think what I'd like to impart to more people in order to simplify this terrain is what I asked. I said, regardless of the situation, is the relation fundamentally one of domination? Is it fundamentally one of control? Is it fundamentally one of hierarchy? And I say this right now with respect to dairy, but we could think of this as any business practice. Regardless of how I'm setting up this kind of really good business, is it fundamentally one of subordination, of domination, and of control? And I think that while I think it would take a longer conversation to see how this kind of really intersects with Jain values, because I think it does, I think this is really the appropriate question to ask. Is the fundamental relation with the other, human or non-human, kind of at its very core one that is not having their consent, their willingness isn't in their best interests? If we can't satisfy that question well, then we kind of have our answer. But beyond that, if we want to have conversations about what causes more harm, what's worse, what's more awful than other awful things, yeah, I mean, we can do that, and there's certainly a priority there. But I would ask folks whenever they're engaging in a relationship, we could be talking about companion animals, recreational animals. What's the nature of the relationship itself? And I think that's really what needs some kind of fundamental deconstruction and ideally improvement. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. My next question is for Dr. Bohanec. How do you explain your Jain values to colleagues and your community unfamiliar with the tradition?
That's an interesting question. My colleagues, I don't have to explain to because it's kind of built into the job. I literally get the podium and explain it when I'm presenting papers. But I think if the question's broadened to people who don't really understand, um, I don't explain anything unless asked. I'm not out to try to convince anybody or change their minds. I do believe in social change and being an active agent in positive social change. But I find that unwanted opinions often create defense and reinforce the very mechanisms that we're trying to work against. So generally, if I'm in a community group setting, company, otherwise, where people don't understand me, I'm just myself. I try to be the best person I can. I try to act in integrity. I try to make friends. I try to just be a good person. And, people will either ask me about my values or not. And if they do, I also am very cautious. I try not to give more information than is wanted. I mean, because, people have their own systems of belief, so if somebody, and I try to respect that, so if somebody wants to ask me about, what I think and why I think, I'm happy to. I often say that an occupational hazard of mine is that I lecture very easily. And I'm constantly trying to rein that in, like, no matter what. I mean, if somebody starts talking about, anything, I have to be careful not to suddenly start lecturing. So, with veganism and my values, under consumption, aparigraha, ahimsa, all of these, I just, if people are interested in me, they're going to ask, and it may influence them or not. And I also live a pretty nice life where I'm very happy and I enjoy my life. I'm just generally a really happy person. And I think that, that might make people curious about, like, why I am as happy as I am. And if they want to ask, fine. If they don't, then, I'm not here to try to convince anybody of anything, not directly at least. But then again, participate in calculated social movements. Like I work with my wife a lot on animal advocacy. I try to be a good person when I show up and I teach, when people are asking my opinion in a professional capacity and I'm giving lectures, I try to infuse it with values, and ethics, because I'm a theoethicist. So, ethics just comes out of my mouth in a professional environment. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the best answer I can do there. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Given the answer that you just gave, I'll give this follow-up question that was also submitted about when witnessing someone acting unethically or exploiting systems, should you speak up or focus on your own conduct? And I'm sure you're already following this, but just for the recording, I'm guessing, I'm curious how that intersects with what you were saying about not pushing more information than people are asking for, and how you're aligned with social movements that promote Jain ethics. Does that come into conflict um, with seeing people having direct uh, unethical action?
It depends. Every time somebody eats a piece of meat when they could have chosen a plant food, that's unethical. And I'm not about to get in people's faces about that. It just is counterproductive. It does nothing. when it comes to Minnesota, resistant ice agents, and people throwing their bodies in between the forces of oppression, I think that is where we need to speak up. And there's places where that's perfectly appropriate. And I'm also deeply Gandhian as well. And so that sort of ability to nonviolently put ourselves in the way of harm, to protect others, I think is that's a form of speaking up to the highest degree, even if that means our own endangerment, our own bodily harm, our own arrest, perhaps even being killed, if, as we've seen. So that's the type of speaking up that I really do endorse, of course, in nonviolent ways, So there's a spectrum in between that where, like, we're exposed to, you know, unethical behavior all the time. People are doing it all around us. And there's just a time and place where it's the time to speak up, and even at your own personal risk. And there's a time where actually speaking up is counterproductive. And so I think just the easiest way to answer that is it depends. But I think there is, you can see how the grade sort of works there. Is speaking up going to actually have a positive effect or a negative effect? And, is it absolutely like necessary too, for like the safety of people? If you see somebody being injured directly physically, I think we're morally obligated to intervene. But I think that gives a sufficient answer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That added a lot of very practical nuance to the question, at least for me. Um, and then for Chris, how do you stay spiritually grounded and reduce your karma amid the demands of modern life?
Whew, I was hoping that you all would tell me because you're all Jain professionals too. No, I mean, really, I've been practicing yoga for a long time, and I see that as part of what keeps me kind of psychosomatically in place, right? When I start to get overwhelmed or there's too much going on at work or whatever it is, we all go through it, right? We all go through these things. And I can just tell you that yoga has been something that has resuscitated me over and over again. A lot of breathing practices, a lot of pranayama, these kinds of things every day keep me allow me to sort of hold it together, right? And I think we all need that. And so I guess what I'm pointing towards is self-care routines will then carry into the rest of our lives, right? Now, the one danger of that, and this is something that's pointed out in Jain studies, fields that we're involved in, yoga studies, religious studies, a lot of fields point toward the danger of that in the sense that it can also make you more complacent if you're not careful. It can make you so self-focused that you forget that you live in a world, a real world, according to Jain philosophy. The soul is real, but so is the world real. And so is karma real, according to Jain philosophy. And so the one thing we don't want to do is, we don't want to get overwhelmed by that world, which it's very easy to do, especially nowadays. And we should take care of ourselves, but we shouldn't allow the self-care to push us so far that we kind of forget that we also have some social responsibility in this world as well. And so I always begin with telling you to do yoga, breathe, self-care, take good care of yourself, because we all need it in some way, shape, or form. However, we all do that, and we all do it differently. So I'm not telling you have to practice yoga, but what I'm telling you is to take care of yourself and also remember that there's an entire world in which we live and work, and we have to engage with, in a way that is ultimately at its foundation, as non-harmful and compassionate as possible. And they'll never be perfect, but always remember to stay engaged.
Wonderful, thank you. And the final question that was submitted with registration, I want to hand over to Professor Dickstein. What are the biggest contradictions young Jains face between their principles and everyday reality, and how should we address them?
I mean, thank you. This is really a question for young Western Jains, and not me. So I think I'll pass on that second part of like, what should we do to address them? But in my experience, whether it's with YJP, YJA, and listening to folks, and even privately over email, is I think I would say my interaction with now second gen and third gen Jains who are living in, say, Europe and North America, which is an increasingly secularizing world. You look at data like Pew Research data on kind of religious affiliation, and not just religious affiliation, but also belief. Um, it, I think, is challenging, say, within the Jain community in the diaspora. And then when I've talked to kind of older Jains who have children, they say that, maybe they're not really concerned that their children do all of the rituals, but they want them to have these values, right? Whether it's nonviolence, non-possessiveness, anikantvad, and whatever. There also seems to be a sense in which they want them to also marry within the Jain community. So it's kind of this very interesting way in which we're kind of like, we just want people to have values and share values. But at what point does that start to fray, or I would say like thin out the Jain kind of like community? So I think that the young Jains that I've interacted with sometimes struggle with the traditionalism of their parents and maybe grandparents, especially living outside of India, and then but also a desire to stay connected in some way. And then there's also the sense of the more kind of, I would say, progressive Jains that I interact with. They really want, I think, their communities to be a part of social justice issues and be connected with current events, and not aligning, right, with kind of more oppressive majorities, but actually looking at more quote unquote minority communities and how we can use Jain values to support them, which might be like literally standing in front of ICE agents in Minneapolis, like I'm living my Jainism this way, or it might be some other way of wealth redistribution. And I think this isn't specific to the Western Jain community. I think it's a lot of other kin communities, but yeah, ultimately it's a question for them. And I'm just, in a sense, trying to listen to what I view as some of these challenges. And the really way out, and the last thing I'll say on this is just listen to what young people have to say. Like if I was speaking to older people, just listen to what young people have to say. They're living it. And if you press me, I'll say they're probably right. They're probably right because they're living in a world that has fundamentally changed. And I think us older generations really don't understand the nature of that world sometimes as good as them.
Wonderful, thank you. Um, uh, Professor Miller, I have a dual question for you that's come in through the chat by two different people around your presentation. One person was asking about diverting water. Does that include dams? And then another question coming up about excavation being prohibited when it's used for building temples.
Yeah, great questions. These are kind of environmentally earth and water element related questions, which of course are two of the four elements in the Jain tradition and very important environmentally as well. So let me start with earth. The destruction of earth to build temples. I think someone mentioned in there, I was just going to answer this question, typing out that, there's certain prayers or rituals that can be done to kind of absolve the karma and ask forgiveness for what it is that has the harm that has taken place, right? One question I pose for that is, do thoughts and prayers really work that way, right? I mean, do we want to get into a state of mind? I mean, and I'm extending this into like contemporary society now, the same question, that when we perform harms that we can simply absolve ourselves by simply saying prayers. Now, I think it's a good intention, it's a good thought, it's good to be thinking and mindful about what we're doing, but what I want to say is, given the mass harms that take place, not just with building temples, just in general in society, is that we also run a certain danger of using prayers to try to solve issues of any kind of harm, right? So with temples, I can see why they would do that, right? I can see why that you want to build a sacred space for the community to meet. We all have to build houses and homes and we live in things, right? And it causes various forms of harm. There's no denying that at all. And so it's a complicated question, but I just want us to think about thoughts and prayers that way. Okay, and then the second thing is about dams. A little bit quicker answer maybe is that if you read in Williams' book Jaina Yoga that I pointed out, I believe it says more. I believe it does say dams in there, and damming was part of the process of something you wouldn't want to do because it would have blocked water flows, feeding aquatic life and other forms of life downstream, plant, human, and non-human, and that would cause significant environmental and life destruction. So dams would have also been prevented. And we see dams coming down in certain places of the world. We see salmon returning. We see what happens when we let nature be as much as we can.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom today with us. We're unfortunately up on time, so I don't want to keep anyone longer than necessary on this Saturday. But I do want to invite everyone here to continue exploring this rich topic with a course that we have on our website called Jain Philosophy and Professional Ethics. It was taught by a professor we work closely with named Benjamin Zank. He is a professor at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. And we will, I believe YJP will be sending out a follow-up email with a discount code to access the course so that you can continue following through with this. I also would love to invite everyone to join us for our next event in this series. It will be led by Professor Dickstein, and it will be called Creating Social Impact with Jain Values. It'll be at the same time on Saturday, April 18th. So that will be 12 p.m. Eastern or 9 a.m. Pacific or wherever you are in between. So I want to thank YJP, thank our faculty, and thank you for everyone who joined in today. And with that, I will hand it back to Tanvi.
Yes. I hope the session was pretty informative and engaging for all of you joining us today. Thank you so much, Arihanta team, and thank you, panelists. The discussion was really productive and intuitive, something I took as so much from the values and the things we spoke upon. And thank you so much, everyone. We'll sign off from YJP and Arihanta together. Thank you, everyone.
Judge Andra, thank you.
Shanindra, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.